I think in the final roundtable that concludes this lecture series, there'll be an opportunity to address the place that the revolutionary history of the United States of America has for the left. But for purposes of brevity, I think there's no better way to summarize the revolutionary history of the United States, the history of the American Revolution, better than simply to provide a scene from Richard Linklater's 1993 film, Dazed and Confused. That film is set on the last day of high school in Austin, Texas, in June of 1976, the waning days of the Ford administration, more generally the eclipse of the Nixon years. And there's a scene in that movie where a high school history teacher, who's made clear her New Left credentials by talking about how wonderful it was to participate in the protests at the Democratic Party National Convention in Chicago in 1968, tells the students as the bell's ringing and they're departing class to go and embrace the freedom of the summer and the end of high school. She tells her seniors, right, and remember, 1976, bicentennial of the American Revolution, quote, "This summer, when you're being inundated with all of this American bicentennial brouhaha, don't forget what you are celebrating. And that's the fact that a bunch of slave-owning, aristocratic white males didn't want to pay their taxes." I think that scene does as good a summary job as one can of the image of the revolutionary history of the United States, of the American Revolution on the contemporary left. And I want to compare and contrast it with what Karl Marx wrote in 1865 on behalf of the International Working Man's Association to Abraham Lincoln in celebration of his reelection. This is a text that Pamela Nogales and Spencer Leonard have assigned for this lecture. I hope all of you read it. It's vital. Marx, of course, is referring to the Confederacy and the revolt against the United States. And he writes, "When an oligarchy of 300,000 slaveholders dared to inscribe for the first time in the annals of the world slavery on the banner of armed revolt, when on the very spots where hardly a century ago the idea of one great democratic republic had first sprung up, whence the first declaration of the rights of man was issued, and the first impulse given to the European revolution of the 18th century. A very, very different account of the American Revolution and its point in its role in the making of modern history. I also want to refer to another Marx quote written earlier in 1848, when he was talking about the revolutions of 1848 in the context of prior revolutions, principally the English Revolution of the mid-17th century and the French Revolution of the late 18th century. Marx wrote, "The revolutions of 1648 and 1789 were not English and French revolutions. They were revolutions of a European pattern. They were not the victory of a particular class of society over the old political order. They were the proclamation of the political order for the new European society. The revolution of 1648 was the victory of the 17th century over the 16th century. The revolution of 1789 was the victory of the 18th century over the 17th century. Still more than expressing the needs of the parts of the world in which they took place, England and France, these revolutions expressed the needs of the whole world as it existed then." Again, these revolutions expressed the needs of the whole world as it existed then. It is essential to consider the American Revolution, that foundation of the first great democratic republic, that land where there was the first declaration of the rights of man. The first impulse was given to the great age of revolution that reached its apex in the great French Revolution of 1789. It's essential to consider the American Revolution in that trajectory from 1648 to 1789, that trajectory of unfolding bourgeois revolution that expressed the needs of the whole world. Now, I want to emphasize that the American Revolution is so important because it is the first self-conscious victory of bourgeois freedom over the old regime. And by bourgeois freedom, I do not mean the freedom of a class or an interest or a section or caste. I mean an epochal freedom rooted in the freedom of labor, the total transformation of society in its length and breadth around the universal free exchange of labor and its products. And it's really in the American Revolution broadly conceived, stretching from the 7 Years' War of the 1750s and 1760s through to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, its ratification in 1788, that we have the first self-conscious victory of modern bourgeois freedom over the old regime. And by the old regime, I do not, of course, mean simply the Bourbon monarchy of Louis XVI that collapsed or began to collapse in 1789. I mean, broadly conceived, the world that existed, the world as it was in 1775. Then that includes, in light of what happens in 1776, that includes not only the absolute monarchies of France and Prussia and Austria, but also the constitutional parliamentary regimes of the Dutch Republic and above all of Great Britain, which I will be focusing on today. And what I want to make clear is while what's so important about the American Revolution, as I've already said, but now to say it in a more concrete way, is its beginnings are in the defense of a local civil society threatened by a series of imperial forms. But in the process of unfolding, the colonial American resistance movement and its radical Enlightenment backers throughout the world have to seek to explain to themselves what's going on. Why is it that that civil society is in need of defense? And in doing so, they come to raise to a level of much greater ideological and intellectual consciousness the character of civil society fundamentally rooted in the universal freedom of labor than ever before. And they come in doing so to make that the basis of the political foundations of the United States of America. And so for the first time, constitutions, political institutions, orders of things are being put in place on a self-conscious understanding of the foundations of civil society in the unfolding freedom of labor. And in doing so, they do not simply preserve their local colonial civil society against British imperial forms, but rather they radicalize it. The revolution moves very quickly from its onset in the 1760s from a defensive to an offensive take. It is now seeking not simply to protect the local colonial civil society, but to expand and extend a cosmopolitan civil society on a global scale. It is seeking to build an empire of liberty that will have no borders ultimately. All right, so let me try and unpack that story of the defense of the colonial civil society transformed into the radical offense of the effort to create to further and expand cosmopolitan civil society in more specific details. But what I ask is that you please keep Gordon Wood's admonition in his wonderful book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, in mind. And his admonition, repeated constantly throughout that book, is that the American Revolution was as radical and social as any revolution in history. And I ask any of you who have doubts about that to set those aside and to hear as openly or to be as open as possible to what follows. And then, of course, I'm happy to stay on as long as people want for the following Q&A to come in its aftermath. All right, so let me set the scene. It is the 1740s and the 1750s where we last left off, the middle decades of the 18th century. And there is a massive global conflagration taking place between the two leading powers of the Western world, Bourbon France, the most sophisticated and enlightened royal absolutism under King Louis XV, and the parliamentary revolutionary regime of Great Britain under King George II. Now, this is not simply the 7 Years' War in Europe or the French and Indian War in North America. Rather, this is a nearly 25-year, quarter-century-long, grand, titanic global struggle between these forces that really begins In the late 1730s and the early 1740s, with the onset of the War of Jenkins' Ear, the Anglo-Spanish War, and then it's generalized into the War of the Austrian Succession in Europe, there's a brief Cold War or hot peace in the early 1750s, and again, open warfare breaks out between them again, in what's known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. What I want to stress is that more or less from the late 1730s and early 1740s to the early 1760s, a quarter century, there's this great struggle between constitutional, parliamentary, revolutionary Britain and absolutist Bourbon France. And it is not simply a struggle in Europe. It is a struggle over the globe. British ministers in Whitehall, the Royal Palace of Whitehall, and in the Parliament, Westminster, and French ministers in Paris and at the court of Versailles think of the world as a global chessboard. They are not just concerned of the needs of the King of Prussia or the Emperor of Austria or the Tsar of all the Russias. They are concerned with the demands of the Confederation of the Iroquois, their leading chief and headman representatives. They are concerned with the claims of Huron leaders. They are concerned with the claims of South Asian potentates. They are concerned with the claims of West African kings. They are constantly in this global conflict for a quarter century. And across this, the whole war begins to bring into this great swirl all of these other societies well beyond Europe, well beyond the Western world, in Native America, in West Africa, and South Asia, and across the oceans. And essentially, what is happening in this war is that it's a grand struggle to determine who will set the character of the geopolitical outlines of Europe and more broadly the world. In British terms, it's a grand struggle to preserve and to really extend on a world scale the empire of liberty. What was that empire of liberty? Well, based on what I said last time, and hopefully from those of you who had the opportunity to look at the readings based on the selections from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, it should be clear that coming out of the 17th century, the English colonies and the British colonies had a very different political and social and economic character than their European colonial predecessors. That had a lot to do with the English revolutionary experience of the 17th century. As we talked about last time, when Parliament defeated the Crown and subjected the state to civil society, it also sought to create an imperial system that covered the entire British Atlantic. And when the radical republic of Cromwell and his successors fell finally in 1660 and the Stuarts were restored, they did not do away with that transformation, that imperial system centered around laws of trade and navigation, centered around this great Republican Navy, the greatest Navy in the history of the world that has now become the Royal Navy. The Stuarts attempted, however, to essentially transform this in an absolutist authoritarian direction. They sought to create an absolute monarchy at home. This is the later Stuarts, Charles II and James II. And they sought to create an authoritarian empire in which their royal appointees, the royal governors of the American colonies, could rule without reference to their local colonial assemblies and House of Burgesses. And in doing so, they sought to create this authoritarian empire and absolute monarchy. But essentially that effort was finally defeated in the late 1680s and 1690s, where a kind of global glorious revolution took place. A glorious revolution that didn't just simply happen in 1688 in England with the toppling of James II and the ascension to William and Mary to the throne as constitutional monarchs, accepting Parliament and the English Bill of Rights, which is also included in the readings as the fundamental basis of their rule, and transforming the English monarchy into a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary regime, accepting the subjection of state to civil society. That was not simply a revolution in England. It was a global glorious revolution because there had been outbreaks of similar revolts throughout the areas of English overseas expansion, English empire. And in the colonies, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, other places, there had been revolts again. And in the wake of all those revolts against King James II in England and his despotic royal governors overseas, there had been put in place one great imperial constitution for an empire of liberty. And that was understood to be an empire of liberty because it was not of conquest, but rather an empire of maritime trade, an empire of colonial settlement, and an empire that was based on the free cooperation and interaction of peoples, and ultimately rooted in a parliament and a rule of law that subjected the crown to civil society in Britain, and the colonial assemblies and the rule of law that subjected the royal governors, the imperial state in North America, to civil society in colonial British North America. Now, as this titanic struggle, we're moving now back to the mid-18th century, the 1740s and 1750s. As this titanic struggle took place between Britain and France, it became clear essentially that this imperial constitution, this empire of liberty, based on the crown working through parliament and law at home, and the royal governors, the imperial state working through colonial assemblies and the law in colonial North America, was being stretched and required reform. Now, there is going to be a reform that ultimately is the trigger of the American Revolution that I'm going to talk about shortly. But it's extremely important to realize that bourgeois radicals, radical Whigs, bourgeois radicals such as Benjamin Franklin, but many others, were thinking about the necessity for the reform of this empire. And if you got a chance to look at the reasons and motives for the Albany Plan of Union that Benjamin Franklin wrote in July of 1754, or his correspondence in December of 1754 with the governor of Massachusetts Bay, William Shirley, I hope you got a sense of this kind of thought going on in the later 40s and 50s about the need for a new set of political and imperial institutions to preserve and extend the British Empire of Liberty. There's a real sense with the massive frontier wars going on with the French Empire and the Native Americans, the massive fiscal and military resources being needed by this global conflagration between revolutionary parliamentary Britain and Bourbon France, that there has to be a reordering of the Empire of Liberty in a kind of imperial confederation where the colonial assemblies come into their own as part of a kind of imperial federation with the British Parliament, of course, at its metropolitan head. But it's vital to realize that that agenda is being put on the table, that is a collective discussion about the need to realize that the strength of Great Britain is this incredible transatlantic British world of collective social and economic cooperation, of voluntary association and exchange that's come into being and should be given a more adequate political and institutional infrastructure to allow for its further flourishing and development. That is, that the Empire of Liberty needs to be made fully institutional and transatlantic. And as Franklin says elsewhere, that one day that will eventually mean that the metropolitan head is not found in London with the Parliament, but with presumably some kind of North American greater legislature that emerges out of the smaller colonial legislatures. Okay, that being said, the 7 Years' War, which is waged between 1756 and 1763 and is known as the French and Indian War in North America, is deeply informed by this bourgeois radical spirit, this radical Whig spirit. Because while Britain is losing in the early years of that war, essentially who's brought into power by Britain's ruling oligarchy, by Britain's landed elite, is a man named William Pitt the Elder, who is understood to be a popular tribune, who is understood to be the champion that comes out of the world of the extra-parliamentary political culture and public sphere, not just of Britain itself and its towns and cities, but also of colonial America, of the whole transatlantic British world. And Pitt's vision is that rather than recurrent, continuous warfare with Bourbon France, that is going to be inevitable if you just make minor gains with France and then go back to war with them later. Rather, he will ask that entire transatlantic British world to contribute fiscally and militarily to one grand final struggle against Bourbon France that will make Britain essentially the sole, if we were to use contemporary terms, sole superpower at the end of the war. And in turn for the fiscal and military commitments to wage that grand struggle against Bourbon France, Pitt is talking about the reform of the empire, the greater participation and inclusivity of the empire. Someone like Franklin and his bourgeois radicals in the colonies absolutely love Pitt because they see him as finally the dawning awareness in the halls of power of the need for the institutional reform of the British Empire of Liberty, so as to create better transatlantic British political institutions to allow for the radical expansion of that empire of liberty. And Pitt is promising that and telling that, and it's under Pitt that France is defeated across the globe. It's by the Year of Miracles in 1759 that France is defeated everywhere from, from South Asia to West Africa, to Europe, to North America. And really, the defeat of France is fully sealed by 1760. Nevertheless, what is so important to realize is that the ruling oligarchy in Britain is increasingly worried about the growing radicalism about this war. The Pitt as tribune of the people, Pitt is understood to be this kind of embodiment of popular sovereignty before the fact, if you will, at the center of the halls of power. And upon the accession of King George III, who is like the broad ruling oligarchy, very worried about these things, Pitt is essentially shuffled out of the halls of power. The war is closed down, and this idea of a kind of democratic liberal reform to create a more adequate institutional framework for a British empire of liberty is essentially shuffled out of the halls of power in favor of a very different reform project, And to talk about that here, for sake of time, I can't go into all of the details, but I want to say what this conservative imperial reform project has at its core, okay? That is whether we're talking about the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which essentially puts a border through developing British colonial North America and says there can be no expansion west of the Appalachians. Rather, that will be one great Native American reservation, and any movement into it, any development of land or commerce must be managed through the British Army and the British imperial state. That Royal Proclamation is passed in 1763. Furthermore, in the early 1760s, the laws of trade and navigation that had not been enforced for really 5 decades are now strictly enforced again. What's more, those laws of trade and navigation, by the way, they say what certain commodities that are very important in colonial production must go in British ships with British sailors, first to London, first to Britain, and then be re-exported throughout the world. But whole networks and schemes of trade and the universal exchange of products has developed across the Atlantic world that has gone way beyond the framework of those laws of trade navigation that were really last rigorously enforced 50 years before. And essentially that reinforcement of the laws of trade and navigation is trying to bring that whole web of trade and interdependency that's developed beyond the back of the actors or any intentionality back within these formal imperial channels where customs, revenue, trade can be raised upon them. Furthermore, this is extended in the Sugar Act of 1764, where essentially a whole regime of new imperial commercial regulations are put in place, designed essentially to really subject all of this economic and social interdependency that's developed to imperial state control, to control in London. And beyond all of that, to raise an extractive revenue from it. And then, of course, the stationing of a 10,000 man strong peacetime standing army in North America. Now, why is that important? That's important because North America had largely been the site of being governed by local militias. And when it was necessary during war, there were standing armies raised. But something unprecedented happens after the 7 Years' War, which is that 10,000-man standing army of redcoats, British regulars, is basically institutionalized, that army. It's going to remain in America, and it's going to be the defenders of the new western border of the Royal Proclamation. It's going to be stationed in key ports and cities to be able to hold customs collections and to work with the Royal Navy on the ports and harbors to make sure that this new, much more restricted trade and navigation regime is enforced. And to fund this army, of course, the Stamp Act of 1765 is put in place. And the Stamp Act of 1765 essentially moves from taxing the economic interdependencies and external exchange relations of the American colonies directly to taxing the colonial population itself. Directly taxing the colonial population itself. And in doing so, entirely cementing the colonial assemblies. Subverting the colonial assemblies. And this is really, really vital to understand, that it's subverting the colonial assemblies, that essentially no such taxes had ever been raised in the colonies before without the royal governors, without imperial officials going to the very democratically elected 75% of adult free males, that is all adult males, that is not women or slaves, but 75% of all adult males were voting in a lot of the colonies. These incredibly democratic assemblies had to vote, essentially. The royal governors had to go and interact with these colonial assemblies and debate with them and negotiate to raise revenues and to raise taxes. But now a parliament in London, controlled by the landed elite, without a single representative from America, much less the broader swaths of British society, really controlled by a ruling oligarchy, is essentially now saying it can raise this revenue and provide for this standing army and imperial officials. And of course, there are other things I don't have time to go, like the Quartering Act of 1765 and other things. What needs to be understood about the Royal Proclamation, the decision to keep a 10,000-man standing army, the restrictive enforcement of the laws of trade and navigation, the addition of new laws of trade and navigation, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, is that all of this represents in its totality an assault on the empire of liberty in colonial North America. Why? It represents an assault on the empire of liberty in colonial North America because in its totality, it will remove imperial officialdom, the imperial state, away from the control of the colonial assemblies. It will, in doing so, it will allow taxes to be raised, revenues to be raised, bureaucracies and militaries to be maintained without any reference to colonial assemblies, without any reference to wider colonial electorates, without any reference to the wider extra-parliamentary political cultures and public spheres of colonial British America. What's happening here, dear audience members, is imperial officialdom is being raised beyond the control of local colonial British North America, and the civil society, the local civil society of colonial British North America, is basically no longer in control of the imperial state. It's becoming subject to the imperial state. And those colonial assemblies will not be shut down by redcoats or dragoons. They will not be burned, but they will become nothing but meaningless talking shops if they are not the central site of raising revenues and therefore determining what's done with those revenues bureaucratically, militarily. What's portended here is that dynamic local civil society we talked about that had come into being in the later 17th through the mid-18th century is threatened with imperial militarization and bureaucratization. And this immediately, beginning in 1763 and 1764 and reaching its apogee in 1765, has a radicalizing effect. More pamphlets and newspapers are published in those years than the preceding 3 decades put together, basically arguing, debating, demanding that this be understood, what's going on. And what's so important to understand, and eventually there's massive riots. I cannot stress this enough. There are riots in 1764 and 1765 that shut down much of the operations of port cities. There are groups that are founded, extra-parliamentary organizations and groups, voluntary associations, that essentially design and enforce a non-importation agreement saying, we're not going to import any British manufacturers or goods unless these imperial forms are withdrawn. And these groups draw up lists of merchants that are following the non-importations and ones that are not. And they subject to popular justice, the People's Tribunal, those that are not following the non-importation agreements. There are whole bands and groups that form to prevent stamp tax collectors. The stamp tax, by the way, is on all legal documents. It's on all newspapers, playing cards. It affects the entire world. It's an egregious example affecting the entire world of this colonial civil society. And these organizations, these extra-parliamentary networks and organizations form that essentially are devoted to shutting down the collection of the Stamp Act, to enforcing non-importation agreements, to harassing merchants who don't do that, and to tarring and feathering either local colonial Americans or British transplants who are willing to observe these imperial forms. And it's really in the context of all of these town meetings in the cities and towns, all of these county associations in the rural areas where people are discussing and debating, where whole newspaper and print culture is coming into being and discussing and debating this. And it's in this world where people are talking about what are the rights of Englishmen? What are the rights of man? What are we seeking to defend here? And this realizes its full apogee in October of 1765, where 9 of the 13 colonies gather in the Stamp Act Congress, which meets in New York City. And I hope you took the opportunity to look at that document. And in that document, this is the declaration. What's so important about that Stamp Act Congress in October of 1765 that meets, and I can't stress this enough, is that it's intercolonial cooperation. It's these voluntary associations and committees, these corresponding societies interacting with one another and bringing about this intercolonial Congress to discuss what's going on with these imperial forms. And it's in their declaration that they argue, quote, that His Majesty's subjects in these colonies owe the same allegiance to the Crown of Great Britain that is owing from his subjects born within the realm, and all due subordination to that august body, the Parliament of Great Britain. That His Majesty's subjects in these colonies are entitled to all the inherent rights and liberties of his natural-born subjects within the Kingdom of Great Britain. That it is inseparably essential to the freedom of people and the undoubted right of Englishmen that no taxes be imposed on them, but with their own consent given personally or by their own representatives. That the people of these colonies are not, and from their local circumstances cannot be represented in the House of Commons in Great Britain. That the only representatives of the people of these colonies are persons chosen therein by themselves, and that no taxes ever have been or can be constitutionally imposed upon them, but by their respected legislatures. That all the supplies to the crown being free gifts of the people, it is unreasonable and inconsistent with the principles of the British Constitution for the people of Great Britain to grant to His Majesty the property of the colonists. Okay, and I want to repeat one line of that it is inseparably essential to the freedom of a people and the undoubted right of Englishmen that no taxes be imposed upon them, but with their own consent personally given by their representatives. All right, if we look at this entire moment, and this moment, by the way, is matched. This whole moment of rioting, rebelliousness going on in 1764 and 1765 is matched in Britain because the failure of the bourgeois radical project around Pitt the Elder and the 7 Years' War. the landed oligarchy's refusal to carry out parliamentary reform and to further liberalize and democratize Britain has actually become quite autocratic within Britain itself. They're attempting to clamp the press, as in the case of the general warrants against John Wilkes and his famous North Britain 45. They're issuing standing armies to sit in major cities, above all London, which leads to the St. George's Field Massacre in 1768, very similar to the Boston Massacre of 1770. And there's a riotous and rebellion going on in Britain, and also British subjects are being hurt in key manufacturing centers and commercial cities, but across the length and breadth of the land are being hurt by non-importation and are sympathetic to the cry of the colonists about this kind of arbitrary autocratic reform. And the reason why I'm spending so much time on this mid-60s period is it's the beginning of a collective debate and discussion, an ongoing discussion of society about itself that is taking place in colonial British America and the wider British Atlantic world, deeply informed by the principles of the Radical Enlightenment. And it's going to go on for the next decade. And in that collective discussion of society about itself, in clarifying what are the rights of Englishmen, how can these imperial reforms go on, how can they be resisted, that the rights of Englishmen are transformed into the rights of man. Let me just say a little bit more about that specifically, okay? Because although essentially the British ministry backs down initially and allows for the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766, in the very same month that the Stamp Act is repealed, that ministry passes the Declaratory Act, which said Parliament has the absolute right to do everything that it can do. It has the absolute right to do everything that it can do. And furthermore, the following year in 1767, the Stamp Act is brought in through the back door when the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, passes the Townshend Acts. I don't have time to go into a nuanced explanation of them, but they're essentially designed to culminate that entire imperial program in the way the Stamp Act was intended to, by removing the imperial bureaucracy and military from control of local colonial assemblies, effectively removing the imperial state from the control of local civil society. Okay, so again, when the Stamp Act is repealed, this ongoing colonial American resistance movement quiets down. It immediately comes back in 1768 with the ferociousness of even more pamphlets and newspapers and organizations. And what's now so important and so key is, coming out of the Stamp Act Congress in 1765, there are these voluntary associations that have begun writing to one another, have began creating collective charters, collective rules for their voluntary and mutual engagement to achieve collective purposes that they couldn't on their own. They are increasingly referred to as the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty organize an even more effective non-importation agreement against Britain, and even more effective resistance to the Townshend duties. And while there is, in 1770, a move by the Ministry of Lord Northern Britain to back off, realizing that there's a potential revolutionary situation in the colonies by removing all of the Townshend duties but one on tea. Nevertheless, when there is later in 1773 an attempt to reassert the tea duty, this whole extra parliamentary voluntary association organizational world come out of colonial society, embodied in the Sons of Liberty and further institutionalized in the Committees of Correspondence in 1772 and 1773, again comes to life more than ever, and is going to give rise to an entire proto-revolutionary structure. The Committees of Correspondence, the First Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress. And what it's so important to realize is that it's in that period from 1764 to 1776, in those 12 years, that the rights of Englishmen are transformed into the rights of man. And in this collective conversation that takes place in town halls and county associations and pamphlets and newspapers and radical enlightenment salons and coffee houses and throughout all of this place is a discussion that what the British Empire has done essentially is undermine civil society and undermine property. And what's so important, dear audience members, is that the conception of property here is not an immutable, divine, natural one. everywhere throughout these discussions and debates is the radical Lockean, John Locke conception of property, which is property is rooted in labor, right? Which comes to the fore is that radical Lockean conception, which is property is rooted in the ability of the human being to transform themselves and the world around them, to create something that's not there. And that property, which is ultimately for Locke the freedom of labor, as he clearly defines it in the excerpts I asked to accompany this lecture, that freedom of labor, that property, that ability to transform oneself, is actually, according to Locke, much greater enjoyed and realized through social cooperation, social intercourse, social congress. That in interacting with one another and recognizing their natural rights to life, liberty, and property, people are actually able, through that mutual cooperation, to transform the world much greater than they could individually. Through that mutual, free, voluntary cooperation, they are much greater able to transform the world than they could individually. And as such, they provide a much greater basis for their own individual self-determination, autonomy, and freedom. Again, I want to make that clear. What's coming to the fore is the Lockean conception of property. The Lockean conception of property is the individual's ability to transform themselves and the world around them. And the Lockean conception that society is that cooperation in Congress, which through division of labor and mutual free voluntary intercourse allows the world to be transformed much more, creating much greater wealth and resources for the self-determination and autonomy of individuals. And already by 1762, as many of the audience knows, this has been further radicalized, this Lockean tradition in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that this collective social freedom is the ultimate grounds for humanity's self-determination and its ability to reflect upon that self-determination, to think how it is so determined and to transform its self-determination and to open up infinite possibilities for its future redetermination, its future transformation. And it's absolutely essential that that radical Enlightenment trajectory from Locke to Rousseau, it's understood that that comes to the forefront during this more than decade period of discussion and debate about the fact people thought that the rights of Englishmen were serving that, were a means to that end. What the Parliament and the King of Great Britain, what the British Parliament and King George III have told them is that they were wrong, that essentially what the rights of Englishmen are meant to do effectively is to assert the supremacy of Parliament in Britain and in the colonies. And what's being told back to King George III and the Parliament is no, the rights of Englishmen are a means to a greater end, which is, as is spelled out constantly in these documents, the freedom of all people wherever they are, whatever their prior customs, precedents, privileges, cultures, languages, what have you. And it's that freedom of labor in the radical Lockean Rousseauian tradition, which provides the basis through free cooperation interaction for a free collectivity that is much greater than the sum of its parts, a civil society that's the grounds of social freedom, and that the freedom of each creates a much greater freedom of all, and that greater freedom of all that is greater than sum of its parts provides a much better basis for a person to be a freely self-determining individual. You can only be a genuine individual in a free society. And it's that which comes clearly to the fore. In this vacuum created by the crisis of the rights of Englishmen, the radical Enlightenment steps in. And in clarifying that, and in institutionally, politically codifying this, it does not simply preserve a state of being that already exists, but it raises it to a much higher level of consciousness and allows it to become the basis for the further radicalization of society as a whole, for questioning things that would have never been questioned for seeking to undermine customs and privileges and institutions that would have never been undermined before, or that never would have been undermined before. And so basically what I want to stress here is that by 1775, at the height of this imperial crisis turning into a revolution, we essentially have the transformation of the rights of Englishmen into the rights of man. But in the history of that change lies an entire world history, an entire epoch's history, where civil society comes into its own, where the bourgeois freedom of labor, both collectively, socially, and individually, comes into its own clarification as the basis for the first time of an institutional order, of a polity, of a genuine revolutionary, radical, Republican polity. And I would like to read to you from something known as the Declaration by the Representatives of the United Colonies of North America, now met in Congress at Philadelphia, setting forth the causes and necessity of their taking up arms. Let me set the scene for you, okay? Between 1764 and 1775, we're now roughly in the summer of 1775, there's come to existence this extra parliamentary organization, from the Stamp Act riots in Congress, to the Sons of Liberty, to the voluntary associations, the committees of correspondence, now giving rise to the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress in 1774 and 1775 as the real basis of authority in these British American colonies. Not any longer, really, in fact, the British Empire itself, or even the colonial legislatures. It's now by 1773, 4, 5, these committees of correspondence and this wider First Continental Congress and Second Continental Congress. And as this alternative political structure is forming molecularly out of colonial civil society, reflecting on itself, discussing and debating with itself, expanding beyond itself, as this whole alternative political structure is formulating, of course, there are skirmishes and conflicts. We don't have time to go back into the Boston Massacre, but most famously, where these two meet is at Lexington and Concord, where a colonial militia operating under the broad aegis of these committees of correspondence and thus the Second Continental Congress and British redcoats come into conflict over who's going to get control of a munitions depot. And essentially a Cold War hot piece, whatever you want to call it, has now broken out at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, the famous shots heard around the world. But nevertheless, there is still a hope. There is still a hope that the British Empire will actually become the bastion of this. Most colonial American radicals want the transformation of the British Atlantic world centered in London because they're aware of the fact that the social and economic cooperation that takes place across the British Isles, across the transatlantic British world, is a much better basis for social freedom and individual freedom than simply the eastern littoral of North America. They want the transformation of London. So you need to take seriously that there's a strong hope by this alternative proto-revolutionary political structure that's come into being, that there will be a reform of the British Empire. There's a very strong hope for that. And basically, one of the leaders of the moderate wing of the colonial American resistance movement, John Dickinson of Philadelphia, and one of the leaders of the radical wing of the colonial American resistance movement, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, get together to pen this declaration in July of 1775, 1 year before the Declaration of Independence, in the hopes to get the British Empire to reform itself, to become, on the basis of the rights of man, a fuller empire of liberty, to liberalize and democratize. And they write, if it was possible for men who exercise their reason to believe that the divine author of our existence intended a part of the human race to hold an absolute property in, an unbounded power over others, marked out by his infinite goodness and wisdom, as the objects of a legal domination never rightfully resistible, however severe and oppressive, the inhabitants of these colonies might at least require from the Parliament of Great Britain some evidence that this dreadful authority over them has been granted to that body. But a reverence for our great Creator, principles of humanity, and the dictates of common sense must convince all those who reflect upon the subject that government was instituted to promote the welfare of mankind and ought to be administered for the attainment of that end. The legislature of Great Britain, however, stimulated by an inordinate passion for power, not only unjustifiable, but which they know to be peculiarly reprobated by the very constitution of that kingdom, and desperate of success in any mode of contest where regard should be had to truth, law, or right, have at length, deserting those, attempted to effect their cruel and impolitic purpose of enslaving these colonies by violence, and have thereby rendered it necessary for us to close with their last appeal from reason to arms. And then they go on to really explain how free labor, based on the free immigrants across the Atlantic world in the 17th, 18th century, has created the colonial British colonies. That it's really this world of of property, of the self-transformation of oneself, and working with others to greater transform the world around oneself. It's this that essentially the British Empire has to essentially adapt to or fall. And this is really vital and really important. I can't stress this enough, because it is absolutely the case, right, that there is a clarity by 1775, 1776 as to the purposes of the political resistance turn, potentially revolutionary situation that there wasn't there before, or that was slowly coming into being. And I know many people, Richard Hofstadter, Bernard Bailyn, and a whole series of people have taught us all to be masters of suspicion about this rhetoric. Oh my God, the colonists are complaining about a few taxes and saying it's slavery and tyranny. But I hope it's clear to you now that what they are standing for is a higher historical right, a radical bourgeois right, which has developed beyond the supremacy of Parliament. However much the supremacy of Parliament over the British Crown may have allowed for the development of that radical bourgeois right explicated in the Locke to Rousseau tradition has developed beyond that, has become aware of itself, has a claim to a higher historical authority, a greater historical purchase on humanity. And what the imperial forms being instituted by these conservative British ministers seek to do is indeed to interfere in the freedom to transform oneself and to voluntarily cooperate the freedom to transform others, to transform yourself, to constitute property, and to exchange your property freely and cooperatively with others in the greater transformation of the world. And that's why in that very document, right, that they write, our forefathers, inhabitants of the island Great Britain, left their native land to seek on these shores a residence for civil and religious freedom, at the expense of their blood, at the hazard of their fortunes, without the least charge to the country from which they removed, by unceasing labor and an unconquerable spirit. They effected settlements in the distant and inhospitable wilds of America, then filled with numerous and warlike nations of barbarians. Societies or governments vested with perfect legislatures were formed under charters from the crown, and a harmonious intercourse was established between the colonies and the kingdom from which they derived their origin. The mutual benefits of this union became in a short time so extraordinary as to excite astonishment. It is universally confessed that the amazing increase of the wealth, strength, and navigation of the realm arose from this source. And the minister, Pitt the Elder, who so wisely and successfully directed the measures of Great Britain in the late war, publicly declared that these colonies enabled her to triumph over her enemies. Toward the conclusion of that war, it pleased our sovereign to make a change in his counsels. From that moment, the affairs of the British Empire began to fall into confusion, and gradually sliding from the summit of glorious prosperity to which they had been advanced by the virtues and abilities of one man, are at length distracted by the convulsions that now shake it to its deepest foundations. This and the subsequent olive branch petition are rejected by George III and the wider British parliamentary elite. The colonies are declared in August of 1775 to be an open sedition and rebellion, and the Redcoats are declared to pursue martial law irrespective of any existing colonial law or authorities or assemblies. And we now have a full-blown war that is not simply I have to stress this. It is not simply a war of independence of colonies. It is first and foremost a civil war within the American colonies between the loyalists known as Tories and the patriots known as Whigs. Now, the reason the loyalists, both the British conservative ministers and the loyalists in America, are going to be referred to as Tories and are going to be referred to as Stuart absolutists of the 17th century. In fact, by this point, the colonial American resistance turned revolutionary moment has an entire story about the recrudescence of Stuart absolutism, the return of the despotism of the 17th century, their need to put on the guise of Oliver Cromwell and the Radical Republic, of William the Deliverer, William III, and the Glorious Revolution, the constitutional monarchy, to fight this recrudescence. And I ask you not to be a master of suspicion about this language, but to take it absolutely seriously. What is going on here is a sense that however long this parliamentary regime may have protected radical bourgeois right, it has now become a fetter, an obstacle, and it threatens it. And a higher historical right has come into being. A higher historical right has come into being. And in that sense, that's why the colonial American turned revolutionary movement is talking about the recrudescence of Stuart absolutism, the recrudescence of Tories. The people that they're actually calling Tories and Stuart absolutists are actually, by 18th century standards, quite moderate and liberal rulers. Quite moderate liberal rulers. They would understand themselves as Whigs, both the conservative ministers in Britain and their allies and loyalists in the colonies. But this much more radical project is coming to being. This much more radical project has come into being, and it's this project that they are opposed to. And it's in that sense that they can be understood as the recrudescence of arbitrary power, of Toryism, of the attempt of the state to escape the control of civil society and to have an arbitrary power through calling taxes without consent over the property of people, which means nothing less than arbitrary power over their life, liberty, their livelihood, their interactions with one another. That really needs to be understood. And it's in that point, essentially, in that outbreak of war and that rejection by George III and the parliamentary elite of the desires for imperial reform, that essentially the Dickinson-led moderate wing basically ebbs in the Second Continental Congress, and the radical wing led by Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, deeply allied to the commander of Continental Forces, George Washington, and his chief consigliere, Alexander Hamilton, that wing comes to the fore, that wing seeking a break with the British Empire so as to achieve, on the basis of the rights of man, the self-conscious clarity of the freedom of labor, a more adequate empire of liberty that would not simply defend the gains of the past, but provide the basis for unfolding unlimited future gains on a global scale. And as that radical movement, a part and parcel of that radical movement coming to the fore is, of course, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, the most read pamphlet up until that point in the history of America, published in January of 1776, where that common sense simply condenses that entire radical ideological transformation of the preceding 12 plus years. And hopefully you looked at the pamphlets of that. And this all comes to a head in the Second Continental Congress in July 2nd and July 4th with the issuance of the Declaration of Independence, the rough draft of which I assume will be discussed much more in the next lecture, is solo authored by Thomas Jefferson, but then in a wider committee, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and others, it is ultimately transformed slightly and becomes the Declaration of Independence. And I know that we're pressed for time, but I really think it's necessary now, within the lens of what's been established, to read the beginning of that. And I hope you will bear with me for this. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. For the first time in the history of the world, political institutions are being understood, are being founded on the self-conscious bourgeois freedom, the freedom of labor in both an individual and a social collective sense, become aware of itself and being institutionalized and politicized in this moment of imperial crisis, turned into the foundation of a revolutionary republic. And it's in this period of the 1770s that these colonies become revolutionary states. And it's in between 1778 and 1781 that the Second Continental Congress sets down the framework to become ultimately the first Continental Congress of this new united republic in the Articles of Confederation, finally firmly achieved and coming into effect in 1781. And I cannot stress enough, dear audience members, that in being so crystallized, this clarity of civil society's victory over the state, this clarity of the freedom of labor at an individual and collective level, in doing this and founding these institutions, it is not simply the defense of something existed. And being so crystallized and institutionalized, it becomes the basis for its radicalization and expanded beyond unprecedented lengths. And you must understand that participating in all of this is colonial society in its length and breadth. All right, that is absolutely vital. Mechanics, artisans, day laborers, apprentices, up to the richest merchants and lawyers, men and women, slaves, free blacks, free whites, Native Americans, etc., across the board included in this process. And what unfolds between 1776 and 1783 is really a war on four levels. And I cannot stress this enough. It is a civil war within the colonies between loyalists, now known as Tories, and these bourgeois radicals, these radical Whigs, now known as patriots. It is a civil war within the British Empire, not a civil war between Britain and the colonies, but a transatlantic civil war between those self-identified radical Whigs and patriots who support the American colonial resistance movement and now the American Revolution, and those conservatives who don't, who say that no, the parliamentary supremacy, the British political system as it exists, is the end point of British liberty, and there will be no further liberalization or democratization. Rather, this is the highest achievement of liberty possible. It is a civil war within the British Empire, and it is really the first political revolution founded on the Radical Enlightenment. And above all else, it is the first great conflict rooted in the self-consciousness of the individual and collective freedom of labor, and the degree to which and what I mean by that is degree to which the freedom of labor has come aware of itself as the basis for itself, its ability to transform itself and the world around it. And this is a titanic struggle. Do not believe the idea that this is a peaceful affair. Do not accept this distinction made between the American and French Revolution. Because when you have the ideological transformation of the rights of Englishmen to the rights of man, when you have the foundation of these small republican states allying in one greater revolutionary republic, you have a complete assault on all of the remaining customs and privileges, all of the remaining hierarchical and egalitarian habits. There's no better explication of this than Gordon Wood's The Radicalism of the American Revolution that I quoted from further. You have an assault on an entire schema of hierarchy, of custom, or privilege. You have women discussing and debating about their own participation. You have the foundation of manumission societies, of abolition societies, on the cooperation between free whites and free blacks who seek to end slavery. you have this incredible radicalization. Once you've achieved and politically institutionalized that self-consciousness, self-awareness, you extend it much farther than itself in these revolutionary republics and this greater unified revolutionary republic as an attack on any element of historic precedent, customary privileges, hierarchy, that it all is an impediment to the full unfolding of modern bourgeois freedom. And this is an incredibly transformative moment. It's an incredibly destructive moment too. I cannot emphasize this enough. Between 80,000 to 100,000, think about this, 18th century terms. We have colonies that are on the way to being 2 million people. Between 80 to 100,000 Tories, loyalists in the colonies, leave and resettle in Canada or in West Africa or in Great Britain and continental Europe. It's a massive upheaval with guerrilla warfare and bloodied mindedness on an unprecedented scale of confiscation of property. A full, genuine social revolution is taking place, ladies and gentlemen, a full, genuine social revolution as this proto-revolutionary government becomes installed in this revolutionary republic, sweeping away the remainder of custom and privileges, sweeping away the loyalists, dealing with them incredibly harshly, and above all, right, allowing for transformations of aspects of society that people didn't even think about. And the one I want to highlight is really that manumission abolition comes from this liberal and democratic energy unleashed by the American Revolution from 1776 to 1783, this greater war of American independence. Okay, this is absolutely vital. And furthermore, the reason why ultimately that the colonists are successful in winning this war is not simply because of the violence within the colonies. It's the much greater support for this war in the wider world, in the world of the Enlightenment, in the Enlightenment of the Western world. The Bourbon monarchy of France signs a treaty of amity with the United States in 1788, declaring not to abandon them in arms until they've achieved independence. Of course, partially that's informed by the court at Versailles wanting a war of revenge against Great Britain, but there are also key advisors, closet Republicans, who support the greater claims of revolutionary America against the old regime of Imperial Britain. And furthermore, there are Enlightenment radicals, revolutionaries, philosophes supporting this war. Just to give you one example, Beaumarchais, right, the author of the plays The Barber of Seville, the Marriage of Figaro, is an important gun and money runner, first illegally before Louis XVI signs the Treaty of Amity. He's illegally doing it, and then he's legally doing it. And Beaumarchais is a key organizer of this entire vast Atlantic network of selling trade. And remember, it's Beaumarchais' plays. It's The Marriage of Figaro that the future Republican revolutionary in France, Georges Danton, says when he saw The Marriage of Figaro, he came out with the French Revolution in his mind. This is being organized all over the world with support intellectually, materially, financially. And it's key to American success, and it's key to American victory, and it's incredibly radical and disruptive. And by 1783, effectively, the British empires gave up the ghost. Meaning, of course, it's really with the defeat of General Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781, that effectively the Battle of Arms has been won, and then a treaty process is negotiated. And that treaty process finally concludes in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And it's essential to understand, right, sorry, what I want to do in conclusion is really to read from you to the Washington circular letter. So otherwise, this is 1783, and George Washington is writing to the governors of the various Republican states, disbanding the Continental Army. It's Washington's circular letter or farewell to the Army, June 8th, 1783. He says, he's talking about what's gone on in colonial come revolutionary America. And he says that there are no excuses for this new revolutionary republic not to well establish itself. It says here, they are not only surrounded with everything which can contribute to the completion of private and domestic enjoyment, but heaven has crowned all its other blessings by giving a fairer opportunity for political happiness than any other nation has ever been favored with. Nothing can illustrate these observations more forcibly than a recollection of the happy conjuncture of times and circumstances under which our republic assumed its ranks among the nations. The foundation of our empire was not laid in the gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, but at an epoch when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined than at any former period. The researches of the human mind after social happiness, not individual, social happiness, have been carried to a great extent. The treasures of knowledge acquired by the labors of philosophers, sages, and legislatures through a long succession of years are laid open for our use, and their collected wisdom may be happily applied in the establishment of our forms of government, the free cultivation of letters, the unbounded extension of commerce, the progressive refinement of manners, the growing liberality of sentiment, and above all, the pure and benign light of revelation have had ameliorating influence on mankind and increased the blessings of society. The blessings of society. At this auspicious period, the United States came into existence as a nation. And if their citizens should not be completely free and happy, the fault will be entirely their own. Now, in that letter, Washington has another purpose, which is to suggest that the Articles of Confederation is an inadequate framework for the revolutionary republic that's come into existence. I don't have time, I'm way past my time to get into the details of that, but essentially each Republican state has its own currencies and weights and measurements, its own customs and tariffs controls. And in that sense, it basically is a very rickety framework for intercolonial come interrevolutionary, now come interdependent Republican cooperation. And the red thread I want to trace through this lecture, why I spent so much time on the 1740s and 50s and that Franklin and the colonial radicals, the bourgeois radicals who want a greater British Empire of liberty, what those radicals were trying to argue for was that there should be a reformed British Empire of liberty in North America, a kind of federal British Empire of liberty with the British Parliament as its head and colonial assemblies locally in control of individual colonies, because this world of voluntary and social and economic cooperation based on the universal freedom of labor, based on civil society, has come into existence and extends beyond any boundaries of Maryland or Massachusetts or New York or Georgia or New Hampshire, much less any boundaries of North America or the Western world. And as such, there should be a political institutionalization of that voluntary social and economic cooperation and association and free labor transforming the world. And so what you need to realize is that the progressive narrative or the neo-progressive narrative of revolutionary American history is a complete myth. There is not some grand revolution between 1776 and 1783 that then turns to a counter-revolution with the foundation of the Constitutional Convention and the ratification of the Constitution in 1788. Au contraire, mon frère, that is not the case at all. All of the key radicals from George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, to, I hope you read Richard Price, Friend of America, bourgeois radical Whig in Great Britain, his observations on the importance of the revolution and the means of making a benefit to the world. All of these people, from long before 1787, from into the 1770s, have been talking about this greater unitary Republican framework, are aware of problems of the Articles of Confederation, and are arguing by 1781, 1782, 1783, just when the Articles of Confederation really fully come into being, that effectively there needs to be a newer, more perfect union. And that quote that I began my first lecture with from Benjamin Rush, that the American Revolution is not complete, only the first great act of the drama is past. In that letter, he's calling for the next great act of the drama in 1787, the Constitutional Convention. Why? Because they want to better embody and unify these Republican states in one much more unitary, federated, revolutionary republic that allows for all of that voluntary social and economic cooperation to fully realize itself. And just as importantly, to provide a framework for its continental and potentially overseas expansion in a much greater realized empire of liberty based on the rights of man. And to do that, you have to have a framework for how to bring new territories in to an empire of liberty, to a federal Republican government based on the consent of the governed. And so in 1787, when those delegates gather from the different states in Philadelphia to determine this constitutional convention, they are, in a sense, bringing their revolutionary success, they feel, to a completion. And when that constitution is successfully ratified by 1788, it takes full effect, and that constitutional republic is declared. For someone like Rush, for someone like Washington, for someone like Price, for someone like Jefferson, for someone like Hamilton, that is the full achievement of the revolution itself. That whole constitutional element for civil society to basically, for the state to be subject, that whole constitutional republic allows the state to be that whole constitutional republic allows continental, potentially planetary, this is really vital, free and voluntary social and economic cooperation. And while doing so, allows that civil society to subject the state to its control. The state will, this grand federal republic coming into existence, will not, I stress, rule over this infinitely expanding civil society, potentially infinitely expanding civil society, but will be subject to it. And they believe that they have set up a great engine for the unfolding of government based on the consent of the governed, for further liberalization and democratization, ultimately for the extinction of slavery. They believe they set slavery on the long road to extinction. And ultimately, what people believe, and this is made explicit by people like George Washington and Henry Knox, that the attraction of this commercial society and commercial republic will be as such to Native Americans in the Western lands that slowly there will be an integration of them through becoming artisans and commercial farmers into this wider empire of liberty. They believe they've set up a great engine for self-government that will remove any obstacles to people pursuing their own individual and collective life projects, for pursuing their own happiness, and a road on which someday, right, slavery will have come to an end and Native Americans may be integrated into such a collective project. And I'm there, with apologies to you for going way over time, I will end. There's obviously much more left to be said, but I know that Chris plans in the following lecture on Thomas Jefferson, the Jeffersonian Revolution, to more explicitly thematize democracy than I have done today. But I really hope that what has become clear is we now have the first self-conscious victory of modern bourgeois freedom over the global old regime. And the first victory, really the only victory still standing in some institutionalized form, of the new world over the old.
Thanks, James. Okay, we're going to jump right in because I think that we're going to go over, I think that we're going to go until 10:15, which means 4:15 if you're in the East Coast of the United States. The first two questions I'm going to ask you are essentially the same. So I'm going to collapse these. The first is by GL and the second one is by Richard Rubin. GL asks, how is the American Revolution the self-conscious victory of the modern bourgeois revolution, a victory of the unfolding of free labor, when half of the United States was dependent on slavery? And Richard, to follow up on that, how does the ideology of free labor face the paradox of unfree labor existing in what was otherwise the freest society on the planet? Samuel Johnson's, he quotes Samuel Johnson, how is it that we hear the loudest cries for freedom from the slavers of blacks? How does one address this accusation of hypocrisy? And we have at least 4 other questions here, and then Ben Tippins raised his hand. So just to keep that in mind, go ahead.
Okay, obviously in 2 lectures to cover, obviously the period from 1500 to 1788, there are things that have been radically truncated. I accept that completely. As I believe we discussed in the Q&A last time, West African slavery comes into being in the British colonies of North America and the English colonies of North America in the 17th century as the solution to a labor problem. That is effectively, originally the labor problem of, remember, you've got a massive project of transatlantic migration and plantation settlement and trade. And the labor problem that presents itself is initially, in that project, is initially mostly met by European indentured servitude, where English men and women and continental Europeans come and accept a temporary period of quasi-bondage in return for their voyage being paid and for being set up afterwards. Now, indentured servants are not going to remain as free laborers on those plantation settlements because there's an abundance of land and they want to become their own commercial farmers. They want to become their own independent household producers. They want to much more free. They want to pursue that project. That's the attraction of indentured servitude. Effectively, by the mid to later 17th century, West African slavery really becomes the solution to that labor problem. I want to stress very vitally here that it is not some kind of racism that exists a priori that makes West African servitude, West African slavery, the solution to that labor problem. Rather, West African slavery exists. The coastal kingdoms of West Africa have an ancient slave trade as existed throughout all of the pre-modern world. But as bourgeois society has been rising beyond the back of the actors between 1500 and 1800, essentially what's happened is these plantations have been taking off. The desire for the goods they're producing have been massively growing in this booming commercial mass consumer society of Western Europe. There's a greater demand for tobacco and indigo and sugar and all of these things than ever before. And so the labor problem is greater than ever before. And so we see a transformation between 1500 and 1700 of the slave trade from a trade primarily driven simply in the slave trade to European slavers of prisoners of war, to West African kingdoms actually going to war with one another to be able to sell slaves to European traders. And thus the whole European slave trade develops on coastal West Africa and becomes an answer to the labor source. And there's a series of black codes put in place, black laws in the 17th century that basically, defines slavery to make it different from indentured servitude, although originally it wasn't that different. What needs to be said is that slavery and unfree labor is absolutely a part of the coming into being of this new dynamic, bustling colonial American society between 1700 and 1770 that I talked about last time. There can be no question about that. It's an element of that. But I think what I hope has come across in these two lectures put together is once come into being, right, that transatlantic civil society, the most dynamic aspect of which by 1770 is colonial American civil society, has gone way beyond its origins in expropriation of land and in the slave solution to the labor problem. It's gone way beyond that. It's become an entire world of collective individual free labor, radically transforming North America. And it's only, and this is what so happened, it's only in that context, through the imperial crisis, the colonial American resistance movement, and the American Revolution, that these values of free and unfree labor are really thoroughly crystallized and made organizing of society as a whole. So your question is asked in light of the transvaluation of values that really only is furthered by the success of the project of the Empire of Liberty, and even more so the American Revolution. There's a transvaluation of values that attends those that makes your question possible. And it was completely familiar to people at the time in the 1760s imperial crisis, much more so in the revolutionary 1770s and in the completion in the Constitutional Convention in the 1780s, that there was this whole world of unfree labor that had to be brought an end to, that should be brought an end to in light of the transvaluation of values, the new values that have been brought to the core of this revolutionary republic. And what I did not have time to refer to is one of the documents I assigned, which is the Slaves' Petition for Freedom to the Massachusetts Legislature of 1777. Okay? And that slaves petition is just one moment in this whole founding in 1774, 5, 6, 7, 8, right through the 80s and 90s, informed by these revolutionary liberal and democratic energies that have been unleashed. The whole founding of manumission and abolition societies of free blacks and free whites, organized precisely to set slavery on the road to extinction. And they understand themselves as being part of the work of the American Revolution, part of the long-term work of completing the American Revolution. And they would have completely agreed with what this slave's position to the Massachusetts legislature says, which is the petition of a great number of blacks detained in a state of slavery in the bowels of a free and Christian country humbly showeth that your petitioners apprehend that they have in common with all other men a natural and unalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe hath bestowed equally on all mankind, and which they have never forfeited by any compact or agreement whatever. But they, whether unjustly dragged by the hand of cruel power from their dearest friends, and some of them even torn from the embraces of their tender parents, from a populous, pleasant, plentiful country, and in violation of the laws of nature and of nations, and defiance of all the tender feelings of humanity, brought here either to be sold like beasts of burden, and like them condemned to slavery, life among a people professing, etc., etc. Let me, skip ahead because I realize people are going to kill me at this point. They say very completely, right? Later on, for those of you who have read this, that sorry, I'm looking for the specific passage. But the specific passage is what they say, where they say there is no way by the principles. Yes, here we go. They write, by them presented to the legislative body of this state, and cannot but with grief reflect that their success had been but too similar. They cannot but express their astonishment that it has never been considered that every principle from which America has acted in the course of their unhappy difficulties with Great Britain pleads stronger than 1,000 arguments in favor of your petitioners. The very question you're asking is the product of a transvaluation of values that is going to raise the problem of slavery and unfree labor, is going to politicize it, is going to make it transformable and removable from the earth altogether. If you remove the American Revolution because of the existence of because of the prior existence of slave labor as a basis for the colonial society that came into existence, you also have to remove that transvaluation of values, that politicization and institutionalization of the radical enlightenment, that making of a problem unfree labor and slavery in world history altogether. The entire basis of your question becomes utterly mute. Utterly mute. You really must recognize the revolutionary transformation that makes possible, that makes your question meaningfully tractable on the world. This is not the preservation of slavery. This is the beginning of setting it on a road to extinction. Now, of course, the founders of the Republic, as Marx says in that letter to Abraham Lincoln, could not foresee the coming of Eli Whitney's cotton gin and the Industrial Revolution and this massive demand for raw cotton. They could not foresee all of the transformation of bourgeois society through the Industrial Revolution fully into crisis and contradiction in the capitalist mode of production. They could not foresee all of that and the way that slavery will come back, the way that a kind of language about the savagery, not the integration of Native Americans, but their elimination will come back. But I want to stress to you that the people in the 19th century, the people that defended slavery in the 19th century and its perpetuation, did not think that it was necessary did not think they were continuing the American Revolutionary Project. They thought that Mr. Jefferson had made some completely untoward and silly remarks in the Declaration of Independence. They rejected that. And because they did not accept the universal equality of that Enlightenment doctrine, they were forced to raise up the flag of the inequality, the superiority and inferiority of races. And I want to stress that that's a rejection of what we've been talking about, right? That's a rejection of what we've been talking about. Because I can't stress that enough.
Paul Henning Schneider asks, could you elaborate on the relationship of the authority of the English Parliament to the colonial society developing in America? Is the authority of the Parliament to be understood in the same way that Adam Smith characterizes the East India Trading Company, meaning as a carrier of bourgeois right, which has been made obsolete and become a hindrance to further development by the advancement of bourgeois society?
Yes.
Okay, then let's move on. Do you have anything else to say about that? Because we have plenty more.
No, I think it's a pretty logical inference of the lecture.
Okay. Stanley asks.
Okay, I'm not trying. I'm just because
Don't go off if you really have answered the question.
I'll say this very quickly. Just give a space of questions.
Mhm.
Listen, you have to realize something, okay? And I realize this lecture has gone on for too long, but let me say something here, which is all of the people, and I did not have time, unfortunately, with quotes I prepared to demonstrate this, but all of the people at the beginning of this revolutionary unfolding in the mid-1760s are talking about the British Empire and the Parliament at its core as being the greatest institution for human freedom ever. The greatest institution for human freedom ever. But within a decade, they are calling about it as more corrupt, aristocratic, based on hereditary status, arbitrary power, an obstacle. And what we have to realize is in that movement, of course, it is essentially this transformation of assertion of a higher bourgeois right. They're not lying, and they're not in contradiction. It is perfectly fine to say the British parliamentary system is the highest achievement of bourgeois right up until the 1760s, and to say that its defeat is absolutely necessary for the fuller, more radical achievement of bourgeois right, right? And it is completely consonant to say that Parliament is the greatest vehicle, the parliamentary system is the greatest vehicle for human liberty that's become one of the greatest obstacles to its further unfolding.
So Stanley asks, in scholarship on the American Revolution, there is a conflict over whether the revolution is more indebted to Lockean liberalism, which emphasizes individual liberty, and republicanism, which is more concerned with the common good. Your characterization of Locke seems to suggest that this is an artificial opposition. So that is between Lockean liberalism and republicanism. Is Locke more Republican than people realize? Is there any value to that liberalism/republicanism distinction?
I think that's an excellent question, and I am not. I think that liberalism republican distinction and that assertion that some kind of republicanism, some kind of communitarian emphasis on the collective, and that liberalism is some kind of libertarian emphasis on the individual. I think that distinction obscures more than it reveals. What I would say is that there is a massive conversation and thought beginning in the Renaissance, extending really and reaching its apogee to the later 17th to late 18th century Enlightenment, about the relationship of individual and collective freedom, and a growing realization that the freedom of all is the best basis for the freedom of the individual, and in turn, the freedom of the individual is the best basis for the freedom of all. There's an awareness of the dependency of individual freedom on collective social freedom, and the dependency of collective social freedom on individual freedom, right? You see this clearly in, particularly, you can trace it right from the 16th century, right from the post-1450, the Gutenberg invention of the printing press, right up to the pamphlets of the French Revolution, released when Louis XVI calls the Estates General in the fall of 1788. There's a clear discussion of the fact that essentially having a radical, allowing individuals to freely speak to the public as they see fit, is a basis for the advancement of ideas, that one may point out a better way to do things, that a collective discussion can take place about a way to improve and reform and transform mankind. And at the same time, that discussion and debate makes all individuals much more culturally and intellectually rich and capable of further contributions. That plays out really clearly. But anyway, not to go off the deep end, I would see it more as a relationship between individual and collective freedom that's unfolding. And in some cases, that is a republic limited to a very small amount of the burghers, like the United Provinces of the Netherlands. In some places, that is a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary supremacy, like Britain. It achieves, I would say, full self-consciousness in the revolutionary American Republic. And therefore, I don't see that as essentially liberal or essentially Republican. It's both. It's absolutely both. Republicanism is the language of the past with which bourgeois society grapples in the 16th and 17th century with its emergence. And liberalism is the language of its self-awareness of what's happened in the preceding 3 centuries. I know that's a crude distinction, but I'll just say it again. Republicanism is that language that exists ready to hand of an unaware developing bourgeois society trying to make sense of the post-medieval, post-Renaissance world. And liberalism is that bourgeois society become aware of itself, really, in a whole series of authors that I'm sure many members of this audience are deeply familiar with, from Kant to Constant to Hegel to Paine, etc.
Spencer Leonard asks, why was the American Revolution merely American? Why did a British Empire-wide crisis get resolved in the way that it did? Is what happened in Britain in the same period describable as a counter-revolution?
Yes, I believe so. James McPherson, in his book on the Civil War, Battle Cry of Freedom, talks about the secession and the formation of the Confederacy as a preemptive counter-revolution. And my view is that the reforms of the British Empire pursued by the ruling oligarchy in George III post-1760 is essentially a preemptive counter-revolution, a sense that basically the British Empire, the transatlantic British world, is spiraling out of control, has to be reined back in, that in a quasi-Hobbesian way, civil society exists solely to serve, or most importantly, to serve the needs of the state, right? Very much rejecting the Locke to Rousseau tradition that no, the state exists solely to serve the needs of civil society. And when the state violates those needs, it can be torn down, and civil society can reconstruct a new state that better serves those needs. So yes, absolutely. I would see what unfolds in Britain between the accession of George III and the reform of the empire, principally in 1763, 1764, 1765, all the way to the consolidation of Lord North's ministry in the early 1770s as a preemptive counter-revolution that ultimately succeeds in and through the American Revolution. Ultimately, listen, there's no more straightforward way to put this, but the American Revolution becomes necessary because the British Revolution didn't happen. The American Revolution demonstrates the necessity of a British Revolution. Because the parliamentary British reform movement could not succeed, because the pressure campaign on the halls of power in Westminster and Whitehall was unsuccessful, because the ruling oligarchy closed ranks towards the existing domestic and imperial political structures and their refusal for their further reform, their liberalization, democratization, it becomes clear to both it becomes clear to the leaders of the colonial American resistance movement that they have no ability to reform the empire, but instead that they must exit it. So the American Revolution is premised on a successful counter-revolution in Britain, a failure of British Revolution. But of course, the failure of the British Revolution can't just be the maintenance of the status quo. It must be the active counter-revolution, which is fully consolidated under Lord North. But I would insist, though, with William Pitt the Elder, that in one of his final speeches in the House of Lords, after violence has broken out between the colonial American resistance movement and the British Army, that effectively, I've already said the American Revolution is made necessary by the failure of a British Revolution. But I would say with Pitt that with the outbreak of hostilities, the British Revolution, and William Pitt is saying this in the House of Lords as the ghosts of Oliver Cromwell and William III and John Locke stand smiling happily behind him. William Pitt says the British Revolution the English Revolution is crossing the Atlantic and being given a renewed life and expansion. So absolutely, yes. there's a successful counter-revolution within Britain. There's a failure of a British Revolution, and the American Revolution is at one and the same time the going beyond, the overcoming, but the fulfilling and achieving on a higher plane the English-British Revolution.
Kathy asks, you stress the importance of the decade of collective discussions in civil society. Who was included in this notion of civil society, and who was structurally excluded from it?
Okay, let me say a couple of things. First off, it's really, really important to realize that in terms of the Western world in the mid-18th century, there is an incredibly high degree of political, social participation. Now, one thing I mentioned was that in most colonies, about 75% of free adult males, basically excluding people under 21, women, and slaves, those people participate in elections, the House of Burgesses, Massachusetts Bay Assembly, et cetera, et cetera. But beyond all that, okay, everyone, right, not to an important degree, women, and by the way, in that franchise, there are free blacks voting in several of the colonies. I want to stress that. In that franchise, beyond that franchise, in this democracy of everyday life, in civil society, women, people under 21, many slaves are also participants. And I want to stress that this actually is not a world of exclusion. If you look, I mean, we have many, many, many records by the 1720s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s, when things are really coming into clarity. Many, many records of voluntary associations, of joining societies, of societies for internal improvements of the colonies, of societies for interconnecting the colonies, of Potomac River expansion, all of these things, of people from all different sorts of backgrounds. So the participation includes from the lowliest day laborer for a wage, an apprentice to journeyman, up through mechanics, artisans, craftsmen, all the way through to elite planters, merchants, what have you, men, women, free blacks, whites, to an important degree, slaves, into this. Obviously not slaves, not fully. I'm not pretending for a second that's the case. But really that colonial civil society, that general democracy of everyday life involves everyone.
So there are a couple of questions. I just wanted to say we have a little bit of time and we're answering the questions through the Q&A. So in case you're writing to the chat box. So there's one question from Richard that's looking a bit ahead, but maybe we can take it on. You described both Jefferson and Hamilton as radicals. You also described the progressive narrative as a myth. Looking towards the future past 1788, how should one then understand the split between the Federalists and the later Democratic Republicans? Were the Federalists betraying the revolution?
Okay. So I want to make a distinction between Federalists and Federalists. All right. So first off, there are those who convene in Philadelphia in 1787 and argue in 1788 at the various state ratification conventions in favor of ratifying the Constitution that comes out of that Philadelphia Convention. They are Federalists in favor of this more perfect union, this federal republic that goes well beyond a confederacy, as has previously existed. And the key leaders of the colonial American resistance movement, revolutionary movement, are all on that Federalist side. Obviously, Jefferson is in France. He's the US ambassador to France at the time. He's not attending the convention in Philadelphia, but his deep, close personal friend and his ideological comrade in arms and his intellectual protege, James Madison, is one of, he was very young in the imperial crisis and the early revolution, but has come into his own in maturity and is very much Jefferson's protege and is very much an architect, the most important architect. I mean, people even coming close might be somebody like James Wilson, but Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, but James Madison is really the most important architect, fully in support of the achievement of the Constitutional Convention. Okay, so what I want to stress is that the Federalists are importantly the heirs to the revolutionary American leadership and to the radical wing of the colonial American resistance movement. And in that sense, what will be the future basis of the so-called Federalist Party, the leaders, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and the future leaders of the so-called Democratic Republican Party, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. These guys are all Federalists in the moment of 87, 88. They absolutely see this as the completion of the American Revolution. No questions asked. These are not anti-Federalists, okay? These were all bourgeois radicals. By bourgeois radicals, I want to stress again, I'm using an epochal category, right? They shared a horizon of politics where all of them basically early on wanted the reform of the British Empire, a greater British Empire of liberty. They then were completely opposed to the conservative reforms that actually came through, the autocratic reforms that came through. They helped organize the resistance movement, and they went on its radical wing. Okay, whatever Alexander Hamilton becomes, Alexander Hamilton in 1775 is a complete and utter revolutionary radical, full stop, the end. Okay, full stop, the end. And that needs to be understood. They share a bourgeois radical, bourgeois revolutionary horizon of politics and a collective project that only begins to fully realize itself in the success of the revolution and eventually the ratification of the Constitution. Now, of course, there are already elements in dispute in the 1780s amongst these people I'm calling Federalists. Amongst them, you can see that some of those people I'm calling Federalists in their contestation with anti-Federalists, they're already having some disputes, right? Which will lead them eventually into Democratic, Republican, and Federalist camps. Okay, so there's a difference between the Federalists and anti-Federalists of 1787 and 1788, and the Federalists and Democratic Republicans of the Washington and Adams administrations, 1788 to 1800. Okay, I have to stress that. And what's so important though, is any of those differences on the radical Whig, bourgeois revolutionary horizon between Hamilton and Jefferson, at that point, prior to the ratification of the Constitution and the completion of the American Revolution, or one grand phase of the revolution, any differences between them are differences over means to the same end. Hamilton has no question that they're creating collective institutions that will allow people to set the course of their own through the freedom of their labor, the control of their property in themselves and in their transformation of the world, to set the course of their own lives and to freely, voluntarily, cooperatively interact with others to transform the world and to set a collective course of their lives. There's no question that Hamilton is absolutely committed to the bourgeois horizon of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, now they will fall out under the Washington administration, and obviously even much more so under the Adams administration. But I must stress they share that horizon. They are all revolutionaries at that time. Now, none of this is to suggest that the Hamilton-Jefferson rivalry, the Democratic-Federalist rivalry, isn't real. I don't want to get into that now because that rivalry is the work of history. So I'm really not trying to dodge the question. Just like last week, I didn't want to get into abolitionism until the ideological crisis that led to the American Revolution. That rivalry is the work of history, of the subsequent historical development of a society whose political institutions have been achieved with the ratification of the Constitution. And therefore, it probably belongs to Chris Cutrone's lecture on the Jeffersonian Revolution, the nature of that split. It is in no way contradictory to say that Hamilton and Jefferson share a project in my lecture, and to say that they now have serious differences in Chris's lecture whatsoever. But I will, since that is the work of history, I will leave the rest of that to the next lecture.
Okay, we have one final question. How do you view it as an American Revolution? Would you consider it a Machiavellian revolution, a Rousseauian revolution? If not, what would you consider it as?
Pam, I'm sorry, something happened and I heard the first part, but then Machiavellian, I think you were saying. Could you state that?
Yes. Or Rousseauian revolution.
So can you just ask the question again? Sorry.
Yes. How do you view the American Revolution? Would you consider it a Machiavellian revolution or a Rousseauian revolution? If not, what would you consider it as?
Oh, okay, sorry, I heard that. No, I would not consider. I mean, listen, I don't want to get into the weeds of historiography, but obviously this is a kind of question informed by the work of J.G.A. Pocock and the so-called Cambridge School of Political Thought. I would say the American Revolution is a uh, I would say, sorry, I'm laughing here because I'm being bombarded with some like private chat questions and I have no idea how to respond to them. I would say that the American Revolution is of course a Rousseauian revolution. I mean, I hope that's clear and not a Machiavellian one. What I assume, by the way, that's meant by that, I just want to be clear to everybody. This is not to do a disservice to Machiavelli. Okay, I want to make that clear. Machiavelli is an important thought figure. He's an important figure in the rise of bourgeois society and in bourgeois society, principally in the Italian city-states, above all Florence, becoming increasingly aware of itself. So I mean no historical disservice to Niccolo Machiavelli. But what is generally meant, people say Machiavellian about the American Revolution, is in this Pocockian vein, that is merely classical Republican, it's conservative, it's a revolt against modernity, and it wants to preserve a world of independent producers and freehold property owners, a world of virtue, et cetera, and it unintentionally unleashes this whole world of democratic, capitalist, and greedy, atomistic transformation. No, not that at all. I couldn't more clearly reject that vision of it, a Machiavellian revolution. But it's a Rousseauian revolution, and I would say that Rousseau is actually the true heir to the trajectory that Machiavelli starts, and is continued throughout radical 16th, 17th, 18th century thought is basically achieved fully and expanded radically in Rousseau.
Okay, I think that is all of the questions that we have. So we actually ended on time. So tune in for next week. So Chris Catrone will be talking about the Jefferson, and I'm sure that he'll address this issue of the Constitution and the division of the Federalists, and what are going to become the followers of Jefferson. I think that then afterwards we have the Jacksonian democracy question that I will be leading, and we move forward. The lecture is going to be uploaded onto YouTube, and thank you for joining us. Bye, James.
Pam?
Yeah, we're going to end now.
Pause
so
your
that
recording.
You can stop recording. I can't do that. So if you'd like to speak, I can give you a call.
Oh, no problem.